Well, thank you everyone for coming to our 6th annual Vicar Conference. It's titled Within Our Grasp, Exploring Reality Virtually. So we're going to start out with a couple of keynote speakers, and then we'll move on to some mini presentations outside of the amphitheater area. So I want to give a warm welcome to our first keynote speaker, JJ Drinkwater, who is a curator of American culinary history at the Special Collections Library at the University of Michigan. As JJ Drinkwater, JJ is the founder and director of the Caledon Libraries and Alexandrian Free Library Consortium in the virtual world of Second Life. JJ has written about the relationships between role play and research in virtual worlds, and how an understanding of this relationship can be useful for educators and librarians. JJ's professional interests include digital repositories, metadata, narrative, intentional community, and the history of everyday life. JJ's presentation today is titled Sideways into the Past, or What Does the Flying Clockwork Under-Footman's Aerostatic-Tea-Tray Have to Tell Us? So go ahead, JJ, and thank you for doing a keynote speech for us today.
Well, good evening, and may I say what a pleasure it is to be speaking at this really wonderful event. I'm looking forward to all of it, and I'm lucky because I get to speak first, and then I don't have to think about it anymore. Marie asked me to talk this evening, or afternoon, or whatever it is where you are, about my work with the Caledon Library. And I will, some, but then I want to go on to something else that I've been pondering. For my whole career as a pixel puppet librarian, the general topic I find myself talking and writing about is what SL has taught me about my own profession. Building a library in a community that was both historical and ahistorical, that is to say Caledon, brought me face to face with some interesting issues, like how to create a sense of a past, a world that is, by modern standards, non-technological or very differently technological in its idea of technology and what it is and what it's for. And doing all this in a medium that's technological in a way that the people of the supposed time frame of Caledon could never even have imagined. I didn't exactly solve that problem, but it did get me thinking. My guiding ideal for making libraries in Second Life is that libraries are part of a conversation, and that conversation is culture with a capital C. When I discovered Caledon, I got very, very interested in the idea of themed communities as communities of interest. And that made me want to create Caledon, a library that would do two things. First of all, reflect its community culture back on itself. And second of all, be useful for research, giving the citizens ways to enrich the second lives they'd chosen to have. The mission statement and the collecting statement sort of wrote themselves. They came on me all in a flash, and I still can't account for it. The mission statement of the Caledon Library is, the Caledon Library serves the independent state of Caledon. We maintain a collection of materials for use by residents and other interested parties. We also host exhibits, book talks, lectures, and the occasional Donnybrook. Since I am an incorrigible, or maybe a hapless humanities person, I started with excitement about 19th century literature, the great flourishing of the English language novel, 19th century poetry, and so on. All along being aware that I would need to have some kind of resources on the multiplicity of aspects of life, art, fashion, government, etc. in the Victorian era. The initial collecting policy, which also came to me in a flash, is this. The collecting interests of the Caledon Library have two main foci, the 19th century and Caledon's defining literary genres, steampunk and alternate history. Within these areas, we collect, first of all, primary source material, 19th century novels, nonfiction works, periodicals, and etc., along with materials from earlier eras considered important in the 19th century, and of course, defining works in steampunk and its parent genres. Second, we collect research materials concerning the world of the 19th century and its imagination, and secondary materials useful for studying Caledon's important genres. I've talked and written about this elsewhere, so I won't belabor the point. One of the things about communities is that they change. As Caledon, over the first 3 years, made a shift in its theme, its vibe, and therefore I judged its interest towards more steampunk and less towards the culture of Victorian England, I had to adjust my collecting. I started shifting my efforts from, say, 19th century fiction to Industrial Revolution era technology. And in the course of that, I came across an interesting volume. It was Jacob Bigelow's The Elements of Technology from 1829, a work which, according to some historians, first used the word technology in its modern sense. The book came along right when an older idea of things that required technique, etymologically derived from an ancient Greek word that can be translated as craft or art or craftsmanship. This was giving place to technology as we now think of it, something with unbreakable ties to science. The library never did realize its plan for a full-fledged technology and engineering branch, but planning such a collection with Bigelow as its core, and that change as its core, got me thinking about technological imaginings. We did, around this same time, address the steampunk and its parent genres part of our collection policy. Caledon librarians Turing Wayland and Eleanor Anderton, along with the redoubtable Serafina Puchkina, who is now the mainstay of the Babbage Memorial Library in New Babbage, put together a steampunk reference collection, which is housed in a dirigible that floats above a garden in Caledon's capital, Victoria City. Later, another Caledon libraria, Dame Mika Brown of the Library Militant, put together a collection of 19th century airship literature. When Caledon lost one of its citizens, who was a lover and builder of airships, we renamed the airship collection in her honor and housed it in a miniature Caledon tartan blimp. Here is a copy of the Sumi Kawashima Memorial Airship Collection. If you're interested, feel free to take a copy. Doing this was another way for the library to be part of a community. Since Miss Skytower is going to have a lot to say about community, I'll just leave you with that thought and move on to steampunk. Just to be clear, what I'm about to say is not a summation of or definition of steampunk, merely a comment about one of its aspects. Steampunk is, among other things, a fantasia on the theme of time. What makes the engine of the genre go is a complicated interplay between the past, the future, and the present. Specifically, it involves a vision of an imagined or possible past, the imagined or possible future of that past, and sometimes an alternative now. This isn't unique to steampunk. Of course, dieselpunk, clockpunk, and similar genres can work the same way. The popularity of steampunk isn't accidental or a random quirk of fashion. Something about it speaks to a wide and varied audience. And, of course, although it might have started there, steampunk is more than a literary genre. It's also a design sensibility, a fashion trend, a lifestyle. What happens when goths discover the color brown, and possibly a desire to stick goggles, gears all over everything. Steampunk also includes a good, healthy dose of nostalgia for something we never had. Why is steampunk so compelling, so appealing? Part of it, possibly, is because it brings alive things that we want to keep, or wish we had not lost, or things that we would like to dream we or somebody once might have been going to have had. It's complicated. Well and good, but why might all this be worth our attention as information professionals? Our culture uses the term fantasy in a trivializing way, but that's all wrong. Fantasy is important. Fantasy lives are important. I'm a great believer in the importance of speculative fiction overall. Science fiction, utopian fiction, fantasy, even horror, even Gothic novels in all their 3-volume glory. How can what we dream or fear or project onto the future or the past or worlds that are simply other not be chock full of information about our culture? Addressing just one literature, fantasy, fairy tale scholar Jack Zipes says, "The miraculous makes self-evident what is wrong with the real world." And it's important that we're talking about literature here, although all the other creative and analytic disciplines shouldn't be neglected in this larger picture. Novelist A.S. Byatt, in the introduction to her recent retelling of the North myths, lauds, quote, "the pleasure of the mind that the unreal offers when it is briefly more real than the visible world can ever be." But there's more. I'll repeat this. It bears repeating. Fantasy is important. Fantasy lives are important because of the space fantasy makes for the space of possibility. Let's look back at that portmanteau term that I used a minute ago, speculative fiction. That is to say, fiction that takes advantage of, stealing from Byatt, the pleasure to the mind that the unreal offers when it is briefly more real than the world can ever be. Takes advantage of that pleasure to speculate, to invite us to speculate. So, maybe thinking about steampunk can be helpful to us in thinking about the information professions. On the most pragmatic level, steampunk stories tend to be driven by technology or technological realities, even imaginary technological realities. So, colleagues, how much of our story here and is driven by technology? How much is the developing practice of digital and virtual archives and libraries driven by technological developments and by people's fantasies about them and what they might or might not make possible? But there's more than that. Why do I think the complicated relationship of yesterday, today, tomorrow, and might be that we find in steampunk is a useful metaphor for our profession? Because I think that's the business that we're in. Just as steampunk manages to exist in a space that is simultaneously past, present, future, and possibility, so libraries and archives are accountable to those four things. Let me break that down, although this will surprise none of you. First, we're accountable to the present. This is just Ranganathan's books are for use, made a little more realistic as materials are for use. Whatever else we may be doing, we're serving the patrons who will come in today, this week, this month, this year. But we're simultaneously accountable to the past. Again, that will surprise no one here. The culturally crucial role libraries and archives play is to preserve the past, whether via primary or secondary sources, and so to make the past available to the present. Third, we're accountable to the future. This is so whether we collect more heavily in contemporary materials or in materials from earlier times that present scholarship considers valuable. That's why, if we're wise and if we're able, we collect and preserve broadly. Because who knows what tomorrow's researchers will be interested in. That brings us to possibility. What do information professionals have to do with possibility? Isn't information real? Otherwise it's not information? I don't think so. Here's what I think. I think we're accountable to the realm of the possible because where do ideas about what might be possible come from? Sometimes, in strokes of genius, ideas of what might be possible are made up from whole cloth, but I think those are necessarily the minority. More often, ideas are born from other ideas. We preserve the record not only of the actual accomplishments of the world and its people, but of the ones that might have been. The failures, the dreams, the impractical schemes, the ideas that were before their time, or look back on a golden yesterday that never was, or were just plain doomed from the start. There's no way to tell what idea might spark something marvelous. So, my insistence on this complicated relationship of history, futurity, the present, and possibility is because I think that all those things are crucial to our cultural and professional charge as managers of the currency of ideas, which is information. And I'm happy to take questions or entertain rebuttals if there are any.